The Other Mode. From Frankenstein's Castle, 1980. As I approached the age of 50, just twice the age at which my first book, The Outsider, appeared, I realised more clearly than ever that my life has been dominated by a single obsession, a search for what I call the other mode of consciousness. An example will clarify my meaning. A musician friend once told me how he had returned home after a hard day's work feeling rather tired and depressed. He poured himself a whiskey and put a record on the gramophone. It was a suite of dances by Pretorius. As he drank the whiskey, he began to relax. Suddenly, he says he took off. The music and the whiskey entered into some kind of combination that produced a feeling of wild happiness, a rising tide of sheer exhilaration. Why describe this as another mode of consciousness, rather than simply as ordinary consciousness transformed by happiness? Because it can lead to experiences that seem completely beyond the range of normal consciousness. A BBC producer friend told me how he had sat in an empty control room at the BBC and played himself a record of the Schubert octet, which happened to be on the turntable. Suddenly, he said, he became Schubert. I was intrigued and tried to get him to be more precise. Did he have a kind of time slip into Schubert's Vienna, so he knew what Schubert had eaten for lunch on the day he started composing? No, this was not what he meant. He tried to explain that he had felt as if he was composing the music, so that he could understand why Schubert had written each bar as he had, and precisely what he might put into the next bar. I saw that what he was describing was not a mystical or occult experience, but simply an unusually deep sense of empathy.
So in the 60s, happy Saturday, in the 60s, Colin Wilson received a letter from Abraham Maslow that said, "Hey, I read your book. We should talk about some things." And they ended up talking about the peak experience, but how sometime in the 30s, allegedly, Maslow said, "You know what, this is kind of messed up. I'm in these psychology classes and all we talk about are sick people." And so he decided to study the finest and healthiest people he could find. And he found that they all had similar experiences that he coined peak experience. Happy Saturday.
Sartre once said that to enjoy a book is to rewrite it. My friend had done the same for Schubert's octet. We are bound to enter into music if it is to be more than just a meaningless noise, but clearly my friend had entered into it 10 times as deeply as usual, like going down in a lift. But then, perhaps it is a mistake to emphasize this element of empathy or sympathy. I had a similar experience when writing a book about Bernard Shaw. A friend had borrowed a book that I wanted to consult, and on this particular morning he returned it. So I sat down at my typewriter feeling pleased I had it back. It was a pleasant warm day, with the sun streaming through onto my desk.
I am smitten with the protean self-creation that Ayn Rand engaged in. I am not smitten with her economic ideas. I am not smitten with her ideas of strict materialism, of disbelief in the mystical or no flexibility.
Right.
And I reject that. I would like to see a society characterized, quite frankly, by a kind of frumpy social democracy circa 1950s.
Well, so was FDR's.
So was FDR's. Yeah. But I look upon Ayn Rand and FDR for that matter, and Madame H.P. Blavatsky for that matter, and lots of figures who are in this book as people who self-crafted their personas. There's a kind of greatness in that. In fact, I think the greatest work Ayn Rand ever did was the creation of her own persona. This adolescent who escapes Stalinist Russia, who comes to America with a bare grasp of the language and becomes a screenwriter in Hollywood, and people say, well, I don't like her books or whatever. It's like, okay, let's just pay attention to the persona for a second, because that's her greatest work. Same thing with Madame Blavatsky.
Everything that disappointed me without anything that I have not already tried and found wanting. I tell you that as long as I can conceive something better than myself, I cannot be easy unless I am striving to bring it into existence or clearing the way for it. That is the law of my life. That is the working within me of life's incessant aspiration to higher organization, wider, deeper, intenser self-consciousness, and clearer self-understanding. It was the supremacy of this purpose that reduced love for me to the mere pleasure of a moment, art for me to the mere schooling of my faculties, religion for me to a mere excuse for laziness, since it had set up a God who looked at the world and saw it was good, against the instinct in me that looked through my eyes at the world and saw that it could be improved.
I was writing the chapter about Shaw's marriage and breakthrough after years of plodding around London's theatres and concert halls as a critic. No doubt I was identifying with Shaw, imagining what it must have been like to feel that he had sailed out of a storm into a quiet harbour. But this was not what explained the sudden feeling of intense joy, as if my heart had turned into a balloon and was sailing up into the air. It was not just Shaw's life that was somehow passing through my mind, it was something bigger, a sense of the multiplicity of life itself. In a sense, I was back in Edwardian London, but it could just as easily have been Goethe's Weimar or Mozart's Salzburg. In fact, this other mode of consciousness is a state of perception rather than empathy, an awareness of a wider range of fact, of the actuality of the world outside me. What has changed in such experiences is our perspective. I'm used to seeing the world in what might be called visual perspective, that is, with the objects closest to me looking realer and larger than the objects in the middle distance, which in turn look realer and larger than the objects on the horizon. In these experiences, we seem to sail up above this visual perspective, and the objects on the horizon are as real as my fingers and toes. This is the experience that lay at the heart of The Outsider. The romantic outsiders, Rousseau, Shelley, Hoffmann, Goulding, Berlioz, Wagner, Dostoevsky, Van Gogh, Nietzsche, were always experiencing flashes of the other mode of consciousness, with its tantalizing hint of a new kind of perception, in which distant realities are as real as the present moment. But this created a new problem. Intense dissatisfaction with the ordinary form of consciousness, with its emphasis on the immediate and the trivial. So the rate of death by suicide or tuberculosis was
Observe that
alarmingly
in
high
most peak
among
experience-
writers and artists of the 19th century. Maslow abbreviates it to... Observe that in most peak experiences, Maslow abbreviates it to PEs, and I shall follow him, the person becomes suddenly aware of something that he had known about previously, but been inclined to take for granted, to discount. And this matter had always been one of my own central preoccupations. My Religion and the Rebel had been largely a study in the experiences of mystics, and in its autobiographical preface, I had written about a boring office job. As soon as I grew used to it, I began to work automatically. I fought hard against this process. I would spend the evening reading poetry or writing, and would determine that, with sufficient mental effort, I could stop myself from growing bored and indifferent at work the next day. But the moment I stepped through the office door in the morning, the familiar smell and appearance would switch on the automatic pilot which controlled my actions. I was clearly aware that the problem was automatism, and in a paper I later wrote for a symposium of existential psychology, I elaborated this theory of the automatic pilot, speaking of it as the robot. I wrote, I am writing this on an electric typewriter. When I learned to type, I had to do it painfully and with much nervous wear and tear, but at a certain stage a miracle occurred, and this complicated operation was learned by a useful robot, whom I conceal in my subconscious mind. Now I only have to think about what I want to say. My robot secretary does the typing. He is really very useful. He also drives the car for me, speaks French, not very well, and occasionally gives lectures in American universities. He has one enormous disadvantage. If I discover a new symphony that moves me deeply, or a poem or a painting, this bloody robot promptly insists on getting in on the act, and when I listen to the symphony for the third time, he begins to anticipate every note. He begins to listen to it automatically, and I lose all the pleasure. He is most annoying when I am tired, because then he tends to take over most of my functions without even asking me. I have even caught him making love, and I lose all the pleasure. He is most annoying when I am tired, because then he tends to take over most of my functions without even asking me. I have even caught him making love to my wife. Many of them seemed to feel that this was inevitable. Death and despair were the price he paid for these flashes of the other mode. Even a relatively late comer to the scene like Thomas Mann continued to think of the problem in terms of these bleak opposites, stupidity and health, or intensity and death. I was inclined to question this equation. In many cases, the misery seemed self-inflicted. Eliot was right when he snapped, Shelley was a fool. Shelley was a fool to fall in love with every pretty face that came by, a fool to believe England could be improved by violent revolution, a fool to give way to self-pity every time he got depressed, and to feel that the situation could be...
Saturday, since I already had like 75% of my Colin Wilson library out, I decided to find the rest of it for documentation. I think we're just past the midway point, week 5 of 9, hosted by the Cosmos Institute, taught by Gary Lockman. Hey, look, it's Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. So yeah, I'm kind of a fanboy. Maybe you can tell. Ordered a few more. They should be here.
Improved by lying down like a weary child to weep away this life of care. The same criticism applies to a large number of romantic outsiders. Still, even when full allowance was made for weakness and self-pity, there was another problem that could not be dismissed so easily. L.H. Myers had called it the near and the far in the novel of that title. The young Prince Jali gazes out over the desert in the light of the setting sun and reflects that there are two deserts, one that was a glory for the eye, another than it was a weariness to trudge. The near and the far, and the horizon, with all its promise, is always the far. The near is trivial and boring. Huysmans had made the same.
So, for example, there is no perception without action. This is a fundamental discovery laid out in detail by physiologists in the last 60, 70, maybe 100 years. There's a very different idea than you look passively at the world and you just see what's there. That isn't how perception works. There's no base level of perception independent of action. And there's no action independent of decision. And there's no decision independent of morality. And that means there's no perception in
point amusingly in A Rebord, where, after reading Dickens, the hero, Des Esseintes, has a sudden craving for London. While waiting for his train, he goes to the English tavern near the Gare Saint-Lazare and eats roast beef and potatoes and pints of ale. Then extractingly has, so to speak, tasted the essence of England, and that it would be madness to risk spoiling such unforgettable experiences with a clumsy change of locality, so he takes a cab back home. Yet, Myers had also glimpsed an answer when he made Jali reflect. Yes, one day he would be vigorous enough in breath and stride to capture the promise of the horizon. He may not have believed it himself, but it was still the correct answer. Vitality. In 1960, my conviction was confirmed by the...
And just at that point, the sun sort of splintered off into all these sort of rainbow prisms all over the Himalayas, and the scientists spontaneously started going, Om, Om. And he said, Om is the sound nature makes when it's in harmony with itself.
Work of an American professor of psychology, Abraham Maslow. Maslow said he had got tired of studying sick people because they never talked about anything but their illness. So he decided to study healthy people instead. He soon made an interesting discovery, that healthy people frequently had peak experiences, flashes of immense happiness. For example, a young mother was watching her husband and children eating breakfast when a beam of sunlight came through the window. It suddenly struck her how lucky she was, and she went into the peak experience, the other mode. Maslow made another interesting discovery. When he talked to his students about peak experiences, they began recollecting peak experiences. Long before I became interested in the occult, I had been fascinated by another example of the powers that lie below the iceberg. I say below the iceberg rather than below the visible part of the iceberg, because it has always seemed to me that man's hidden powers are located in the sea, below the iceberg, as much as in the iceberg itself. As everyone knows, Proust's vast novel, À la recherche du temps perdu, sprang from a single incident in his childhood, just as Graves's theories in The White Goddess sprang from his experience behind the cricket pavilion. One day, feeling tired and depressed, Proust's hero is offered by his mother a small cake, called a madeleine, dipped in herb tea. As he tastes it, he experiences an exquisite sensation of sheer happiness. I had now ceased to feel mediocre, accidental, mortal. After eating another bite, he recalls what has caused this feeling of power and happiness. The Madeleine has revived memories of his childhood in a small country town called Cambrai, where his aunt Leonie used to give him a taste of her own Madeleine, which they had had, but which they had often overlooked at the time. Moreover, as soon as they began thinking about and discussing peak experiences, they began having them regularly. In other words, peak experience, the moment when the near and the far seem to come together, is a product of vitality and optimism, but it can also be amplified or repeated through reflection by turning the full attention upon it, instead of allowing it merely to happen. The case of the young mother reinforces the point. She was happy as she watched her husband and children eating, but it was an unreflective happiness. The beam of sunlight made her feel, I am happy, and instantly
day, as I was going past, I pinned it down, and I got a tape recorder with me, and I put it on tape. And I forgot it. And a year later, when I was passing this corner again, I thought, my God, I had that insight, and I've forgotten it totally. Then I went home, I went through all my tapes, I managed to find the tape, and I suddenly found what I'd said on that tape. And what I'd said was this. We appear to have three value systems. One's connected to the body, and by values I mean, your feelings, your responses, your reactions. So that, you can be feeling marvellous at 9 o'clock in the morning and absolutely miserable by 11 because you're hungry, you've got a headache or something. We just have these physical ups and downs. Our values change. But we're used to that. That doesn't worry us. What's far more dangerous is the emotional value system.
Intensified it. It is as though we possessed a kind of mirror inside us, a mirror which has the power to turn things that happen into experience. It seems that thought itself has a power for which it has never been given credit. This was a major discovery. It meant that, contrary to the belief of the Romantics, the other mode is within our control. Shelley asked,
What's far more dangerous is the emotional value system. We suddenly get into these moods like I was coming back from Plymouth thinking, oh God, what a bore. You don't even notice you're doing it. You see, it seems to me our intellect, our minds, do their best to tell us the truth. The mind keeps us on a fairly straight level. It's the emotions that go up and down. Now, I put this into the form of a Confucian parable. I said, when the intellect is the emperor and the emotions are the grand vizier, then suddenly the whole country is serene and well organized. When the grand vizier usurps the throne and turns the emperor into the grand vizier, in other words, has the intellect underneath him, then quite suddenly the whole country is miserable and chaotic. Because I can see that
the other mode. From Frankenstein's Castle, 1980. As I approach the age of 50, just twice the age at which my first book, The Outsider, appeared, I realize more clearly than ever that my life has been dominated by a single obsession, a search for what I call the other mode of consciousness. An example will clarify my meaning. A musician friend once told me how he had returned home after a hard day's work feeling rather tired and depressed. He poured himself a whiskey and put a record on the gramophone. It was a suite of dances by Pretorius. As he drank the whiskey, he began to relax. Suddenly, he says he took off. The music and the whiskey entered into some kind of combination that produced a feeling of wild happiness, a rising tide of sheer exhilaration. Why describe this as another mode of consciousness, rather than simply as ordinary consciousness transformed by happiness? Because it can lead to experiences that seem completely beyond the range of normal consciousness. The spirit of beauty, why dost thou pass away and leave our estate, this dim vast vale of tears, vacant and desolate? The answer in Shelley's case was clearly that he went around with the assumption that human existence is a dim vast vale of tears, and regarded the peak experiences as visitations of the awful shadows of unseen power, instead of recognizing that the unseen power lay within himself.
What does Nietzsche
What we are speaking about
mean when he says Christianity is Platonism for the masses? On the surface level meaning, he's saying that Christianity is a dumbed down version of Platonism. But why does he say this? And the reason has to do with the metaphysics of both. And in fact, the metaphysical similarities between Platonism and Christianity has a lot to do with why so many of Plato's dialogues still survive, because they were copied and studied and used by Christian philosophers in the millennia following Plato. And at the very heart of the similarity between the two is the question of what is real, what is immortal, what is unchanging. And for Plato, the answers to these questions do not lie in the material world, in the visible world. Virtues and representations of the good cannot be found on earth in their purest, realist form. These things only partake in what's actually real, which exists beyond this world. So for Plato, there's the physical world, and then there's the world of the forms, which is where the things that are real are. That's where beauty really is. That's where goodness really is. For something describing what is real, it's a pretty abstract way of thinking about it to use the word form. But he's saying it that it's beauty itself. So it's not like a thing that is beautiful, a person that is beautiful. That's beauty. And we can't see beauty itself on earth because that's not where it is. We can see things on earth that have a share of beauty, but we can't see beauty itself. And for Plato, the way you can access beauty, for example, is through the intellect. Everything on earth that partakes in whatever form will die, will fall away, is innately impermanent. These forms are what is permanent and what is immortal. And you can see why Nietzsche is writing that this is Christianity with extra steps, basically. The underlying philosophy of Christianity is that life in this world is impermanent, that there is a separate heavenly divine world where things last forever. There are other similarities, and there are, of course, differences between Platonism and Christianity. But I'm always thinking about the concept of the endurance of truth, so that's what I've chosen to highlight in this video. What
is what Gottfried Benn called primal perception, where a sudden sense of matchless clarity gives the world a new minted look. We find it in the sharp outlines of Japanese art, with its white mountain peaks and electric blue skies. T.E. Lawrence describes one in 7 Pillars of Wisdom. We started out on one of those clear dawns that wake up the senses with the sun, while the intellect, tired after the thinking of the night, was yet a bed. For an hour or two on such a morning, the sounds, scents, and colours of the world struck man individually and directly, not filtered through or made typical by thought. They seemed to exist sufficiently by themselves.
Afterwards, their minds were not their own, but then whose minds were they? During her talk at Lilydale, Asti paid moving tribute to her beloved late brother-in-law, Paul Auster, a great writer and a great reader whose relationship to books was an inspiration to her. And while it might be misleading to call that relationship hysterical, hysteria does throw a light on what unreserved immersion in a book can do. Reading is a kind of very powerful magic that takes us over completely. While we read, we think thoughts that aren't ours, and ideas that sit on the page as inert objects begin to dance in our heads. Objects become subjects. Books live many lives, and they live them through our flesh. When we read, we are in an intimate embrace with the dead, our skin stretched over their bones. Not that anyone wanted to talk about that during Asti's days as a graduate student in Paris in the 1980s.
Okay, happy Sunday. Who is Colin Wilson? Our lives are primarily dominated by the robot. The robot takes over mundane, trivial processes of everyday life to free up our attention to deal with novelty, creativity, the evolution of consciousness, what we're here to do. Now, we live primarily in the worm's eye view, and this is the root of all of our troubles. If we could learn to shift from worm's eye to bird's eye, we get a flood of meaning. Life has new relevance for us. And sometimes that shift happens without us trying, and we slip into the mystical experience or peak experience. As humans, we should direct our capacity to learning how to shift between those two perspectives, between the brain hemispheres, and Wilson thought he found a way to hack into that. Happy Sunday.
They're a part of nature that one can bring inside the house.
They are the interim step between the wild animal and culture and civilization.
They're such a source for man's imagination. They've inspired music, art,
sculpture, poetry.
They've been deified.
Cats, through art history, have always had all sorts of meanings associated with them.
Of course they're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful to look at. All cats are beautiful. Even ugly cats are beautiful.
And goodness knows the cat has been depicted in art as long as we've had art.
There are 4,000 years of cats in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They may be hiding, but they're there.
Lawrence has also
May be hiding,
the reason that
but
we
they're
experience
there.
primal perception so infrequently. The filter of thought, of the mind's expectations. It could also be described as the robot, the mechanical part of us. Our robot is invaluable. It takes over difficult tasks, like driving the car or talking a foreign language, and does them far more easily and efficiently than when we are doing them consciously. But it also gets used to spring mornings and Mozart symphonies, destroying the glory and the freshness that makes the child's world so interesting. The robot may be essential to human life, but he makes it hardly worth living. The robot seems to be located in the brain. This is clear from the effects of psychedelic drugs like LSD and mescaline, which apparently achieve their effect by paralysing certain chemical messengers in the brain. The result is certainly a form of primal perception, as Aldous Huxley noted when he took mescaline. He quoted Blake's statement, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." So cleansing the doors of perception is basically a matter of brain physiology. In the mid-60s, I began reading books on the brain. One result was a novel called The Philosopher's Stone, in which I suggest that the secret of primal perception may lie in the prefrontal cortex. But it was more than 10 years later that I came upon a crucial piece of research that threw a new light on the whole question. The result was revelatory. The Laurel and Hardy Theory of Consciousness. From the magazine Second Look. A couple of months ago, I found myself involved in the rewriting of a film script about that legendary hero, Flash Gordon. In one of the scenes, Flash's old friend and ally, Professor Zarkov, is being held prisoner by the secret police of Ming the Merciless, who proceed to brainwash him with a machine that is intended to turn him into a loyal servant of Ming. But 10 minutes further on in the movie, Zarkov has to reveal that the brainwashing was unsuccessful. The reason given by the previous scriptwriter was unconvincing, not to say absurd. I decided on something that sounds at least more technically convincing. The human brain has two halves that are almost identical, and the question of why this should be so is still unsolved by the science of brain physiology. We have, it seems, two separate memory systems, and, to some extent, each half of